in the heart of Victorian London, something was about to go terribly, terribly wrong. It's 1858 at Madame Cotton's fireworks factory in Lambeth, London. In cramped, powder-filled workshops, young children slave away. Young hands working with deadly precision, rolling paper cases, mixing volatile powders. The explosion was catastrophic, its seismic force shaking houses for miles around. The blast was so powerful, victims died before they hit the ground. 2 innocent 11-year-old girls were among 5 killed in that blast. And somewhere, in another factory, more children at work, waiting for the next explosion. How did a single, foiled plot give way to such catastrophes? Welcome, dear connoisseurs. It's time for another story about the dark side of Britain's colourful history.
The Gunpowder Plot. Why London burned every November.
To understand why Victorian London descended into chaos every November, we must travel back in time to meet Robert Catesby. He was a Catholic gentleman seething with rage at Protestant King James I, who had promised religious tolerance but delivered rather the opposite. They would eliminate the king and the government at the state opening of Parliament in one spectacular strike. Points for ambition, one must admit. They began with rather more enthusiasm than sense. Their first attempt involved digging a tunnel, back-breaking work that nearly killed them. Apparently, Catholic gentlemen weren't particularly adept with shovels. Then luck intervened. Percy managed to rent a cellar directly beneath the House of Lords, a total game changer. By July 1605, Guy Fawkes was engaged in history's most dangerous game of hide-and-seek, smuggling 36 barrels of gunpowder into that cellar, concealing them beneath coal and firewood. Enough explosive power to transform Parliament into considerably less Parliament. Their undoing arrived on October 26th in an anonymous letter to Lord Monteagle. "Stay away from Parliament," it warned, "because they shall receive a terrible blow." Monteagle, displaying admirable self-preservation instinct, ran straight to the King's chief minister. At midnight on November 4th, Sir Thomas Knivet searched the cellars. There, he discovered a man calling himself John Johnson, guarding a rather suspicious pile of wood. Underneath, 36 barrels of explosive death. John Johnson was, naturally, Guy Fawkes. The game was up. The other conspirators fled London, attempting to rally Catholic support, a strategy that proved about as successful as their tunnel digging. 3 days later, royal troops cornered them at Holbeach House. Catesby, Percy, and the Wright brothers died in the shootout. Fawkes and the survivors faced trial for high treason. January 1606, they were sentenced to be hanged, drawn and quartered, a punishment that makes modern health and safety regulations seem rather reasonable. Fawkes, displaying rebellious flair to the very end, cheated his executioners by breaking his neck, jumping from the gallows. Even in death, Fawkes managed one final act of rebellion, denying the executioner his moment, the original party pooper. And thus, political fear transformed into a public spectacle. Every 5th November thereafter, Protestant England would light bonfires to celebrate their deliverance from Catholic treachery. What began as a political commemoration would evolve into something far more complex, a celebration revealing deep fissures running through Victorian society.
2 nations, 1 night, the class divide of Guy Fawkes.
Fast forward more than 200 years and observe. Guy Fawkes Night has evolved into 2 entirely separate celebrations. Same date, different worlds, a fascinating study in control, violence, and competing visions of patriotism. For the working classes, the 5th of November meant street-level pyromania. Think less polite family gathering, more organized chaos. The Bonfire Boys weren't quaint tradition. They were gangs. In the southern small towns of Lewis and Guildford, these weren't community groups. They were territorial armies using Guy Fawkes Night as cover for settling scores. The violence reached such intensity that in 1847, Lewis required police reinforcements from London. Not a few extra constables, proper reinforcements. The Bonfire Boys would clash with rival groups, attack police, and transform streets into battlegrounds. They'd burn effigies not merely of Guy Fawkes, but of local dignitaries, political figures, and the Pope. One can only imagine the diplomatic headaches. The bonfires themselves were immense communal efforts, not tidy, council-approved affairs, but colossal pyres constructed on street corners from gathered wood, old furniture, anything combustible. Effigies of Guy Fawkes would be ceremoniously thrown on top. During the Victorian era, working-class children would drag tragic-looking Guy Fawkes effigies through the streets, chanting,
"Please to remember the 5th of November, gunpowder treason and plot. I see no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. A penny for the Guy."
Sometimes with implied threats.
"If you don't give me one, I'll take two. The better for me and the worse for you. Ricket-a-racket, your hedges shall go."
Children were pioneering the art of seasonal extortion centuries before trick-or-treating reached British shores. And all the coppers they collected, they pooled into purchasing even more fireworks. Meanwhile, the upper and middle classes were enjoying the festivities differently. They conducted their own private displays, controlled environments on their estates with known guests and carefully managed risks. It was less a political statement, more a social one, an opportunity to demonstrate pyrotechnic prowess while maintaining respectability. Their focus was decidedly social. Guests gathered around manageable bonfires, sipping hot drinks, biting into toffee apples, and indulging in a sticky gingerbread cake from Yorkshire called Parkin. It was a civilized spectacle rather than street warfare. One also imagines the conversation was considerably more refined. Now the establishment viewed working-class celebrations with alarm and disdain. They perceived the riots and begging as threats to public order, which, to be fair, they rather were. The later Victorian movement toward organized public displays represented civic sanitization, taming wild, ancient tradition into safe, family-friendly spectacle. Property damage was constant. Uncontrolled bonfires would spread, causing considerable destruction. The night was a fire marshal's nightmare, had they existed in any meaningful capacity. Substantial sums were spent on repairs and cleanup. But there was a bigger, more deadly problem that was a terrible occurrence every single year.
The human cost, when celebration turned deadly.
Newspapers spread the same grim story across Victorian Britain, November after November. What was supposed to be a celebration prompted headlines that read like war reports. Children severely burned when bonfires collapsed. Women were dying from their dresses catching fire. The press documented these tragedies with grim regularity, filling columns with accounts of preventable deaths and horrific injuries. These weren't isolated incidents. They were the predictable consequence of mixing crowds, alcohol, homemade explosives, and precisely zero safety regulations. Guy Fawkes Night transformed a celebration into a deadly gamble, a lottery where the prize was survival. Rockets were the worst. Young people lost limbs to the explosions of homemade contraptions without safety fuses or predictable trajectories. Misfires were common, exploding prematurely, sending burning fragments into crowds, or firing horizontally instead of skyward, turning spectators into targets. Constables were routinely attacked with fireworks being used as weapons. Rockets were deliberately fired into police lines, and burning brands were thrown at officers. The property damage was staggering. Uncontrolled bonfires spread to nearby buildings. Sparks ignited thatched roofs, wooden fences, and anything combustible. The shift toward sanitized, council-approved events wasn't driven by Victorian prudishness. It was driven by body counts. Local authorities realized they couldn't continue to allow unregulated public spectacles that produced such casualties. The transition happened gradually through the 1870s and 1880s as councils assumed control of bonfire locations and began requiring permits. But even regulated events carried risks. The fundamental problem remained. Victorian fireworks were inherently dangerous. Every sparkler, every rocket, every Roman candle was a potential bomb. The human cost extended beyond immediate victims. Families were destroyed by medical bills for treating severe burns. Children were left permanently disabled and would grow up unable to work in an era with no social safety net. Breadwinners were dying in accidents, leaving widows and orphans with no support. By the 1880s, annual casualty reports had become routine. Editors would prepare space in advance for the inevitable November 6th stories about serious fireworks mishaps. But can you believe these public tragedies were merely the visible face of an even darker reality? These fireworks were manufactured in deadly conditions that would send today's workplace health and safety regulators into a frenzy.
The hidden horror inside Victorian fireworks factories.
Most Victorian fireworks originated from what were essentially explosive workshops tucked behind ordinary houses. Picture someone's garden shed filled with gunpowder, potassium chlorate, and other chemicals that could ignite from the slightest friction. Now imagine a fellow who's probably had a couple of pints at lunch, mixing these compounds by hand. Not exactly reassuring. Children as young as 10 would spend 12 to 16 hours a day handling materials that could kill them instantly. They worked with no protective equipment, breathing air thick with sulfur, saltpeter, and charcoal dust. The atmosphere in these workshops was literally explosive. One spark from static electricity, one metal button scraping against a table, one moment of carelessness, and everyone inside would be dead in the blink of an eye. Workers would mix gunpowder by hand, combining ingredients in wooden bowls with wooden spoons to avoid sparks. They'd roll the mixture into paper tubes, pack it tight, and add fuses made from cotton soaked in saltpeter. Every step was a gamble with death. The sensible factory owners, and there weren't many, would spread operations across dozens of small, separate sheds. The theory being that if one exploded, it wouldn't trigger a chain reaction. But many operations were crammed into single buildings, maximizing profits while minimizing safety. Economics trumping survival, as it so often does. Madame Cotton's factory in Lambeth was typical of the worst practices. Her establishment had already been destroyed 3 or 4 times before that fatal day in 1858. Each time she rebuilt on the same spot, employing the same dangerous methods. Friends had warned her that using children to handle volatile materials was madness, but cheap labor was too profitable to abandon. The warning signs were everywhere. Lloyd's weekly newspaper had noted the previous explosions, questioning why gunpowder was still being brought to the same location. But regulation was minimal, and profit margins were everything. July 1858, the inevitable occurred. The explosion was heard 3 miles away, and people described how the sound shook houses across London. Sarah Ann Vaughan Williams and Caroline Bridges, 2 11-year-old girls whose only crime was walking down the street at that unfortunate moment, were killed instantly. The casualty list was staggering. Over 300 people were injured, with around 40 suffering serious, life-altering wounds. Many were children who'd been working in the factory. Others were passers-by who'd rushed to help after the first explosion, only to be caught in secondary blasts. Good Samaritans punished for their compassion. The newspapers were horrified. The Daily Telegraph demanded answers.
How many firework factories are there in the metropolis? Where are the next 100 persons to be burnt, scorched, flayed, and put in danger of their lives?
A letter of warning appeared in the Times 5 days after, highlighting the madness of employing young boys and girls to handle such extreme materials. It predicted further disasters unless practices changed. A prediction that proved, sadly, rather accurate. These were children making entertainment for the masses. Every whistle and bang in the November sky, every sparkling illumination at a private garden party, all were manufactured by workers who faced death daily for pennies. The deadly cycle was perfect Victorian capitalism. Poor workers created dangerous products for wealthy consumers, absorbing all the risk while receiving none of the profit. The people who could afford the safest celebrations, private displays on country estates, were protected from the consequences of how their entertainment was made. A rather neat arrangement, if you happened to be wealthy. Madame Cotton herself died, a week after the explosion, from injuries received in the blast. Her death barely registered compared to the children who'd perished, but it illustrates the democratic nature of explosive manufacturing. Death didn't discriminate by class when the chemicals ignited. The government response was typically Victorian, slow, inadequate, and focused more on appearances than substance. Inspectors began poking around workshops, introducing regulations about spacing between sheds, limits on explosive materials, and requirements for woolen clothing with no metal fastenings to reduce static sparks. Sensible measures, implemented far too late. But enforcement was weak, and the fundamental economics remained unchanged. Demand for cheap fireworks continued to grow, driven by the expanding Guy Fawkes celebrations. Factory owners had every incentive to cut corners, and workers had few choices, forcing them to accept dangerous conditions or starve. The Illustrated London News later called for stricter enforcement of laws prohibiting dangerous manufacturing in common dwellings, but change came grudgingly. Each new regulation was fought by manufacturers who claimed safety measures would make their products too expensive. Meanwhile, the workshops continued operating, and the accidents continued happening. Smaller explosions that didn't make national headlines became routine occupational hazards. Workers developed their own superstitions and safety practices, but these were inadequate protection against inherently lethal processes. The children who survived often carried permanent physical and psychological scars. Disfiguring burns, respiratory damage from chemical exposure, and the trauma of watching friends die. A heavy price was paid so that others could enjoy pretty lights in the sky, one of Britain's favorite traditions. Whenever you see fireworks around Bonfire Night, save a thought for the Victorians who suffered for the spectacle. The sanitized Guy Fawkes celebrations we know today emerged from decades of death and chaos. Every rocket that soars into the sky carries the memory of those who died making it possible. The Victorian era taught us that spectacle without regulation is carnage, that tradition without oversight becomes tragedy, and that the price of uncontrolled celebration is always paid by those who can least afford it. Thank you, dear connoisseur, for your time with us. If you were captivated by this story, please like and subscribe for more untold tales that reveal the dark foundations of our most cherished traditions. Because sometimes the most interesting stories are the ones we'd usually rather not remember.